Well, good morning. Thank you for joining me. I am your everyday average Jonathan. I'm an ordinary guy with ordinary tools, making extraordinary things. I'm an amateur blacksmith, a novice woodworker, a self-taught craftsman. The items that I make tend to be whimsical in nature, fantastical, echoing times of a forgotten yore, if you will. Items such as weapons, armor, implements, furniture, items that I use every day on my ranch here in Colorado. This week I will be making a scabbard for the Roman Gladius that I made a few weeks ago. The Roman Gladius is a short sword that the Roman legionaries used. This one will be similar to the wooden ones that I've made in the past, but following the traditional style. I look forward to having you along with me on this build. Let's get to the shop and get started. I keep all sorts of interesting and irregular pieces of wood in my wood rack in the shop, any sort of valuable wood. I have a big rack outside the shop for your posts and your timber type. But of all the wood that I have, this is a Home Depot 1x4, just your very basic piece of pine that I chose to do the scabbard in. Mainly because it's going to be stupid light, which is good, and I'm going to have to get this thing down to a very narrow size without compromising the integrity of the scabbard. I bought this planer from a garage sale, and I've had it for a long time, and it's been just absolutely great for me in my various projects. And I'm going to go ahead and just transfer a rough outline of the blade directly onto both pieces of wood and go ahead and start to plan out routering those profiles out from the wood. Again, the blade is probably 5/8 of an inch or so, so I'm going to router out just under half of that depth. I've made a few sheaths, a few scabbards, some large, some small. This is the easiest process to make two hemispheres out of wood. I've seen full leather sheaths that are hardened with water so the leather becomes extremely form-fitting. And I've actually seen a few scabbards that were one single piece of wood. I'm not quite certain how they did it. Maybe they burnt it out with the blade, but it's been very impressive to see those. I don't dare to try that on my own. And instead of planing this and planing this and planing this down, I'm going to just go ahead and use my table saw here and go ahead and rip that wood down to the thickness that I want it to be, which is quite thin. First I'm going to start off with the leftover pieces on the sides just to get it down, and then I'm going to go ahead and rip it like I'm doing here straight across that blade. One of my main desires in these videos is to demonstrate that a person with just your average cheap Home Depot tools, salvage yard tools, backyard sale tools can make these creations and can become a creator. I don't have a dust collection system, so I use my leaf blower to blow everything out. My shop tends to be very dusty, but I try to keep it as clean as I possibly can. Just gluing up these two hemispheres, going to clamp them together, let them stand overnight, and come back and check the progress. Going to go ahead and cut in the tapered end at the tip, as well as remove any of the outside portions that I don't need. I can do this on my sanding wheel, I can do this on the bandsaw, but a little bit of both seems to be the right fit. On my router, I'm just going to go ahead and do a little bit of a round over, giving it just a cleaner, more pleasant feel. There are a lot of things in my projects that I have a love-hate relationship with. Epoxy is one of them. I tend to be a fairly impatient person, and epoxy is one of those ones that you need to have the patience and the diligence to measure it right. But what I'm doing here is I wanted to coat this really light, really fine-grained pine with some epoxy so that by the time it solidifies, it actually is a fairly solid piece. It doesn't crack as easily. The effect was good. It turned out the way I wanted it to, but it did take overnight and a little bit of course sanding. Here I'm making these copper rings that are going to go on the sides of the scabbard. Most of the time Gladius scabbards seem to have 4 rings, 2 on either side and 1 on the bottom. And because it was the Bronze Age at the time that these were around, the copper seems to be a nice piece. Notwithstanding that, copper is just so much easier to move the metal than it is with iron, so sometimes I use this to cheat and get by. I use a little bit of solder to close up those gaps just to give it a uniform look. And here I'm going to go ahead and cut out 4 strips of brass to hold the rings on. I'm going to go ahead and use rivets to capture these brass strips, which will hold the rings to the sides of the scabbard. As I do with wood, I collect all types of metal pieces, and I somehow had these brass straps that were in my copper and brass bin, and they just became perfect straps to have going around the sides of these scabbards. And just like copper, this brass is very ductile. It moves very quickly, so once it's on the scabbard and in the position, it's very easy to remove some material and get it to have that perfect profile that I needed to fit the sword. And now it's time to go ahead and put those little rings onto the sides of that strap that is going to go around the scabbard. After tapping a hole in, I am using pop rivets, which is, I think, a little bit cheatsy, but I just found that it was just the fastest, easiest way to do this, and there are definitely times I make a few concessions that aren't historical. And here's the pop rivets that I'm gonna put on there. To be quite honest, I kind of hate pop rivets. They just seem so cheap, but in this particular application, they were really the best thing that I could come up with, other than doing steel rivets, which just would have taken forever and probably would have broken those brass straps. Now just doing my wire wheel polishing. As I've said in some of my other builds, I don't like things that look amazingly shiny and completely unused and perfect. I want things to have a used earthland feel to them, a battle-worn feel to them. But I am going to take off some of the burrs and get this not perfectly smooth and shiny, but close enough with some patina in the cracks. Yes, more epoxy. That's going to be what fastens these to the scabbard and keeps them on. On the bottom side, which you'll see in a little bit, I did add rivets to keep the bottom strap in place. But on these top 2, it just worked out perfectly to have these epoxied straight onto the scabbard. The first bottom strap that I used at the very bottom tip of the scabbard, which you see in my hand here, did not come out the way I wanted it to. So here is my copper and brass bin. I'm going back through looking for things that I've collected in the past, and I found just the perfect thing. It's an old door knob entry handle plate from an old door. I don't know what you would call it, but it's brass, and it actually worked out perfectly. I just had to remove that little centerpiece, which I just drilled out here with a step down bit.
Almost all of the designs I come up with are designs out of my head. Yes, I do have reference material, things that I've seen, things that have made an impression on me, but I don't tend to replicate or use them, and that's the same case here. What I'm doing here is I'm hammering this brass so that it has a hammered look, it has a distressed look, it has a earthen look. I don't want it completely flat and shiny like I said earlier. Now I'm taping up the brass parts because I'm going to put several layers of a paint primer on top of this scabbard. Steel wool or a sanding sponge, it does a really good job of making a hammered surface look patinaed, look weathered, because it doesn't get everything and make it uniformly shiny. And I'm taking that piece that I just cut out right there and I'm gluing it on. I'll be honest with you, my love-hate relationship with epoxy continues. The epoxy didn't really set up, so I needed to use the rivets that you'll see here in a minute anyways. And it ended up coming out okay. It's certainly not the best design that I've ever done. I find that copper roofing nails make great rivets. The one side is already hammered out for you, and just as long as you're able to get these down the way that you want to, they make awesome rivets on projects like these. I could not come up with and figure out the color that I wanted the scabbard to be. I tried sort of a forest hunter green. I did not like it. I tried that gray, that metallic gray. I didn't like it. So I did do a little bit of research, and they tended to just be black most of the time. So black it is. And here is the final product. It came out okay. I think certain parts of it were good. It holds the sword tremendously well. It fits the guard extremely well. The rings on either side look good. They work well. The bottom portion of brass that I put on there, I just don't like the design. I don't like the way it looks on there. It looks a little bit cheesy to me. I did use an old piece of jade that I've had since I was a kid just laying around, and put it on the bottom of the scabbard, making it look as though someone of influence might have owned this, someone of conquest might have got this from the Far East. So thank you for joining me on that build. That was a lot of fun to do. It was fairly straightforward, fairly easy to do. There are two takeaways from this build. First one is a bit of a no-brainer. My love-hate relationship with epoxy remains. I used both the pre-mixed epoxy as well as the epoxy that you yourself mix, both of which did not work well for me. They didn't set up, they didn't cure, whatever it is, it just continues. I'll have to continue trying to get that right. And the other takeaway that I have is this. Most of the time when I am making designs with metal, I will draw them out on graph paper first, and then I will cut them out and draw those designs straight onto the metal and cut that out. This particular time around, I drew straight onto the metal. I didn't even measure it. I didn't get the dimensions exactly right. I just cut it out, thought it looked good, put it on. I don't like the way that bottom piece of brass on the scabbard looks. It looks a little cheap to me. I could have done a much better job on it. Be that as it may, I will go back to drawing things on graph paper. Next week, I received a commission to make a warhammer. I'm very excited for this build. I will be chronicling that in detail, and I look forward to having you along with me on the journey. Until then.